May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." Sound familiar? It should, because it is almost the exact same line from the first Sunday of Epiphany, following Jesus' baptism, prior to the call of the disciples, which we've been reading over the subsequent week, and his public ministry. But the first message, that first Sunday's message, was for him. Quoting from that lectionary, "And when Jesus had been baptized, just as he came up from the water, suddenly the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, 'This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased.'" Now we read this message 6 weeks later, but the Gospel of Matthew has actually jumped 14 chapters and has included the happenings of Jesus' life that had transpired over years. The disciples have heard Jesus teach. They have seen him heal. They have been with him as he has challenged authorities and cared for vulnerable people. Their lives have had the unique vantage point of a close friend to the Messiah, with likely innumerable signs done in their presence, many of which, maybe even most of which, aren't written in the book that we read every Sunday. But have the disciples ever really seen Jesus for who he was? Or was he always just who they wanted him to be, reflected through their eyes? Maybe teacher, maybe conquering king in wait, maybe powerhouse prophet. Their image reinforced again and again in his actions and their justifications. How often is that our narrative of God? God limited by our realities and imagination. The God we expect. The God we want. Slave owners saw a God who gave them permission. Chauvinists saw a God who gave them power. The majority have used God time and time again like a hammer, like a secret weapon, a nuclear arsenal backing up seeming righteousness with threat, with domination, and even violence. In 3+ years of following Jesus around, in participating in miracles and ministry, this mountaintop is where they confronted the truth of God's Messiah and God's power. And instead of a hammer, they found humility. When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up, do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. The voice of God challenged what they thought they knew. And in that moment, they knew nothing at all. We as Christians try to meet this story at its height, on the mountain, at the declaration. Yet that misses the lived narrative of the story. The mountaintop didn't give the disciples clarity. They missed the actual epiphany, the lesson of the moment, until much later in their ministries. The cross and resurrection were still utter mysteries. And this heavenly declaration does not even give Peter the reassurance and courage to end up at the foot of the cross weeks later. The disciples walk back down the mountain, not in a glow of knowledge, but instead, the next chapter follows with a barrage of questions about Elijah and about their inability to do the same work that Jesus is doing in their presence. Like the disciples, more often than not, our clarity of God isn't from when we feel the most righteous or self-assured, but when we realize that we, in fact, don't know anything at all. We as Christians take this mountaintop moment and act like it's meant to be our epiphany, using it to leap into a Lent, into a journey towards Holy Week, where we purify ourselves in such a way as to earn the cross, to make ourselves holy and righteous, to participate in light and change of transfiguration, as if we can change the narrative of the gospel, and if we understand the mind of God. And then, like the disciples, we find ourselves fearful and failing, where our best laid plans don't align with our lived realities, and we see ourselves as broken and faithless, as the disciples did as they come down the mountain. God instead sees us as human and missing the point. The difference between the two declarations, one from the start of the ministry of Jesus and the one where he is reaching the pinnacle of his worldly ministry, are the ending three words: listen to him. Listening is the transformation from confirmation bias faith, where we know what we're looking for in God and then feel satisfied in our finding it, to discernment and awareness and intentionality around our broken, around God's presence, and into participating in the healing and serving work of God as God displays it to us. Do we really see Jesus? Or do we imagine the Messiah we want to see? Do we see ourselves? Or do we see the people that we want to see? Sometimes in the best of ways, sometimes in the worst of ways. Now, years ago, when I had just graduated college and I first started working with children, I discovered the two-hit rule. This guiding principle teaches you the real value of the question, and what happened before that? Rarely does a kid hit someone completely out of nowhere. Something preceded the strike, something you didn't see, something maybe moments ago, something maybe years ago, something maybe at home that didn't even involve that other child. But as the grown-up in the room, you can't solve the problem by only addressing the strike you see. But digging into what really is going on takes time, and sometimes forces you to break your assumptions about the kids in front of you or about the situation you think you witnessed. And depending on the severity, can mean that you have to find solutions way more complicated than some punishment or some payback. It is the heart of listening, to know that all things come from somewhere, but we have to be ready to listen and to get all the backstory. Earlier this week, when a student fired a gun at another student at Wooten High School, there was suddenly a rush, particularly online, towards solutions, towards the strike we could see. SROs, metal detectors, pushing adult criminal charges, and a plethora of immediate steps have been demanded with a level of and feeling of clarity and certainty of how justice should work. But the media coverage instead harkened me back, because as a freshman, I watched the horrors of Columbine on my television unfold. Since that day, there have been 652 school shootings. There have been 10 school shootings since January 1st. The kids are not all right. And now 3 generations of children, the millennials, the Gen Zers, and the Gen Alphas, haven't been safe in their schools and with some of their peers. And we, as the grown-ups in the room, haven't been willing to listen beyond our assumptions and hear why. Broken is the shooter. Broken is the student in a hospital bed. Broken is now a school full of kids whose innocence was shattered. Broken are ripples of households who waited anxiously for texts and pickup confirmations to know of a loved one's safety. Now, our broken doesn't signify the absence of God. Our broken doesn't signify faithlessness or failure. Our broken doesn't mean that we aren't beloved by our Creator. Instead, our broken is a symptom of pain and cycles, of missed opportunities, and messages we haven't been willing to listen for. Our broken is an invitation to listen. To listen for God, yes. To listen into the backstories. To listen to what is true rather than our opinions and what we assume. What the disciples missed that day, why they don't get that their Messiah would also be a victim of our empire and power and assumptions, was the presence of God is always most palpable when we intentionally seek it, not our assumptions and our bias, but when we stop, we listen, we reflect on why, and we let God humbly surprise us. This Lent, instead of giving up or taking on, instead of attempting to earn the resurrection, we as church are invited into the work of intentionality, looking at the broken in ourselves and in our society, looking at the beloved in ourselves and in our community, and listening intently to how God calls, how God heals, and how God asks us to respond. No, the mountaintop narrative does not call us to clarity. It calls us to intentionality, to ask, to listen, and to act, but into the deeper, fearless, love-filled response of God. Amen.